The holy trinity of watches, Audemars Piguet, Patek Philippe, and Hi everyone and welcome to 000A. I'd like to give a big thanks first off to Timepiece 360 in Dubai for lending in the watch we're going to be looking at today, and that is the Vacheron Constantin Overseas Chronograph Generation 2. The Overseas was actually Vacheron Constantin's second serious attempt at joining the integrated bracelet sports watch segment created by Audemars Piguet in 1972. After a relatively short run of the 222 in the 70s and 80s, 1996 saw the first generation Overseas arrive 3 years after the Royal Oak offshore and a year before the release of the Aquanaut. And Vacheron found itself now competing with two model lines in the segment from its two biggest competitors. So in 2004, Vacheron Constantin decided to bridge the gap between the two offerings from its other Holy Trinity siblings with the Generation 2 Overseas. The increase in size to 42.5mm meant it was no longer diminutive next to the offshore, but it still maintained the sleek profiles of the Royal Oak and Nautilus and was just as comfortable on rubber as an Aquanaut. Then in 2012 came the introduction of the blue dial Overseas Chronograph, with white gold applied indices instead of the Arabic numerals of the first gen chronograph or the Explorer style numerals of the Gen 2 three-hander, and still maintaining the asymmetrically sized chronograph registers and the big date that first made its debut on the original Overseas Chronograph. Fitted with a matching blue alligator strap, this iteration also created a look that never really stuck with any of its competitors, but still exemplified the versatility of Vacheron's no-compromise offering in the steel sports watch segment. There are no octagons, no wings, nothing resembling a porthole, and to this day it hasn't really been imitated by others either. If you want something that looks like an Overseas, you get an Overseas. The 42.5mm diameter at first glance might seem prohibitive, but the case of the Overseas not only features a short integrated lug section, but also angles downwards, and the lug junction allows for the strap or bracelet to have a greater range of motion compared to the current generation model, meaning it's more accommodating to a broader range of wrists without sacrificing visual presence. And despite being an automatic chronograph, the use of the integrated Frederic Piguet 1185 chronograph movement allows this 150-meter water-resistant sports watch to measure only 12.5mm in height. And it's this thin profile that means the watch, especially on a leather strap, can do double duty as a dress watch or to the office just as easily as it can accompany you to the pool, jacuzzi, or beach on a rubber strap or its bracelet. On the inside is what Vacheron calls the 1137. A Frederic Piguet 1185 chronograph movement favored amongst higher echelons of horology for its thin profile despite being an integrated automatic chronograph. Vacheron modified the 1185 by adding a big date with the crown-operated quickset, giving the Overseas chronograph its distinctive dial layout. It also features a column wheel and a vertical clutch, allowing for smooth engagement and continuous operation of this 3-register chronograph. But the Overseas Chrono's technical features go beyond what's housed inside. Behind the engraved case back of a naval training vessel lies a soft iron cage to provide this high horology sports watch with anti-magnetic properties that were far ahead of their time when compared to its contemporaries in 2004, and still quite exceptional even in 2020. Despite its technical capabilities though, the ultra-luxury sports watches are all about attention to detail and finish. The second gen Overseas makes it particularly easy to notice how thoroughly every piece has been thought out, and this is made apparent in how many times their Maltese cross logo appears on this watch. Obviously there's the white gold applied logo on the dial and the appearance on the crown, but that's pretty standard on most luxury watches. But on the second gen Overseas, there's the shape of the bezel carried over from the first generation, and the clasp not only features it on the outside, but even the swing arms on the inside are shaped to evoke the logo as well. And while this example doesn't feature the bracelet, this was the generation that also managed to start incorporating the logo even into the bracelet links. The alligator strap featured on this model, however, was perfectly matched to the rich blue of the dial. And possibly the best example of Vacheron's fastidious attention to detail is the dial on the Generation 2 Chrono. From the symmetry created by the big date at 12 o'clock versus the usual 4:30 position found on most 1185 derivatives, to the calculated asymmetry of the chronograph registers. The minute register is the largest, followed by chronograph minutes, and the smallest dial being the small seconds. The high regard for legibility and ergonomics, and a blatant disregard for cost cutting, there are 5 different sizes to the white gold applied indices to adapt to this layout, most likely a nightmare for standardizing production and driving costs higher. But these watches aren't about standardized production or cutting costs. There are companies from Richard Mille to Omega to De Bethune to show us what the next levels of technical capability are. But it's the companies like Patek, Audemars Piguet, and definitely Vacheron Constantin that show us what the extent of craftsmanship and attention to detail can really be. And this Generation 2 Overseas Chronograph really puts a spotlight on Vacheron's capability to do so. Unlike the hundreds of Royal Oak and Nautilus impersonators and homages, Vacheron created a unique design that not only fights up at their level of quality and luxury, but more importantly, it honors the original concept behind the luxury sports segment established by the Royal Oak, creating a watch so well finished and detailed in steel that it gives just as much luxury and prestige as a model in gold or one crammed with technical innovations. So that's my thoughts on the Gen 2 Overseas Chronograph, and this was an amazing experience, not least because this is the closest I've gotten to doing a full review on what is my Grail watch, which is the current 3rd generation VC Overseas dual time. And there's so many similarities between the two, so much of the magic was there, and it really cemented to me the reasons as to why I feel like that's my Grail and I've chosen that as my Grail. But enough of that, let's bring it back to the positives and negatives of probably one of the most underrated Holy Trinity sports watches ever produced. And the first thing I have to highlight specifically about this example, this Generation 2 Overseas, is the dial. Of course, that blue is so incredibly beautiful. The blue dial was released comparatively later in the Generation 2's life cycle in 2012, and it really made an amazing addition because it's such a deep blue. It's electric blue, but it's not too saturated, it's not too dark, it's Goldilocks, it's just right. But even more than that, the big date is obviously emblematic of this particular generation, and it does help to differentiate it a bit and represents a modification on the Piguet 1185 on the inside. And last but not least, even little details like the asymmetrical dials. They're not all the same size. There's actually a bigger chronograph minutes register because they feel that's what would be most important to read. So all those little things contribute to making, in my view, what is probably one of the best looking VC Overseas dials ever made, and probably one of the best chronograph dials ever made as well. The second big positive about this watch is how thin it is. It's only 12.5 millimeters thick. By comparison, the current Overseas Chronograph with the in-house movement is 13.7, so it's pushing on 14 millimeters. And that's approaching the thickness of a lot of less special chronographs. So I think more than anything, the fact that they managed to keep it thin gives it a bit more of that high horology air. At the end of the day, thinness is something that we associate with higher horology, something we associate with Patek, with Vacheron, with AP, with JLC, with Lange. So I think the fact that this still embodies that is an amazing advantage on this watch, and I think just enhances the overall proportions of it. And also it enhances the versatility, which is the third point. This is supposed to be a sports watch, but it really is an amazing all-rounder. And being something that is Grail material, being an all-rounder can be very important to you because you might save up and have this just as your only watch. So things like the 150 meter water resistance, the anti-magnetic properties, the fact it can easily double as a dress watch because of how thin it is and how good it looks on the leather strap, as well as putting on a rubber strap or putting on a bracelet. It can really cover every single occasion, and on top of that has a useful complication in the chronograph and the big date. So you don't really lose out in any direction on this watch from a functional or versatility perspective. Now I could talk about the positives of this watch all day, but the fact of the matter is no watch is perfect, and this still does have some negatives that I need to highlight. The first one is that while this does have the versatility in theory to be able to wear different straps and cover everything, because of the way that the bracelet is integrated or the strap is integrated, you need to go custom. You don't have a lot of options for aftermarket. While that is a concern on things like the Nautilus and the Royal Oak as well, because those are more popular, there's more options out there for non-OEM straps. Whereas with the Overseas, its proprietary junction, you're pretty much stuck going OEM, which can drive the price of a replacement strap up quite a lot. The second negative is the outsourced movement. This particular one came out in 2012, and the original chronographs came out in 2004. For perspective, in the year 2000, the Daytona already had the 4130 in-house movement with a 70-hour power reserve. In 2006, Patek was already using an in-house chronograph for its 5980 on the Nautilus. In 2009, Breitling had introduced the B01. So while maybe when it was first introduced, the second gen Overseas was appropriate and acceptable for its time using outsourced movements, over time it did become more outdated, less special, and carried a lesser sense of exclusivity versus something like the Patek, which it was trying to compete with. And while yes, the Audemars Piguet was still using the same 1185, and it still is to this day, it still is something that does reduce a bit of the specialness. And obviously that's reflected in the pricing. The Gen 3 one was $7,000 more than the Gen 2, and part of that is because it features an in-house movement. So it shows that Vacheron Constantin themselves even recognize the added value that an in-house movement would bring to this watch. So I have to point that out as a negative if at this price point you think that having an in-house movement is a priority. And then the last negative, and this is something I will berate every time I see it because from an engineering standpoint it's simply not necessary. Of course, the Omega Seamaster 300 chronograph achieves this without them, and that is the screw down pushers. My gripe with screw down pushers is that by the time you've unscrewed them, you're already a few seconds late, and most chronographs are usually about precision, not long term, so you probably do need to worry about how many seconds you're looking at. However, despite all of those, this is still an amazing watch and possibly one of the best value Holy Trinity sports watches out there. When it was brand new, it sold for $21,000 US, but now that it's been discontinued for 4 years, this sells for anywhere from about $12,800 up to $28,000 US. So even in its most expensive iteration, which were usually blue dial variants with the full bracelet, it's still just touching what the retail is of the current one. And for a bit of perspective, the current one, yes, it retails for $28,000, and on the pre-owned market it sells from $21,000 up to $36,000. So even the minimum buy-in on the new one is much more. And while you do get the quick release straps, in-house movement, see-through case back, this watch still has a lot of that Vacheron specialness. And you need to remember that this is really the one that set the design tone for the Overseas. While the original Generation 1 got it started, if you look at the jump from the Gen 1 to the Gen 2 and then the Gen 2 to the Gen 3, you can tell that Vacheron didn't really want to mess with the design because clearly they had gotten it very, very right on the Generation 2. And the chronograph was the best example of that. And then even looking at something like the AP Royal Oak, which uses the same movement in their Royal Oak chronograph, that retails for $26,000 US and is still available today. However, on the pre-owned market, you're looking anywhere from about $25,000 up to $42,000 US. So again, a much higher buy-in for a watch that has the same outsourced movement as this one that you can get for as low as $12,000 and up to a max of $28,000. So definitely there's a lot of value packed in when you consider that this is still a watch made by the Holy Trinity. It's still made by one of the oldest manufacturers around. It's still made to the same high standard in terms of the finishing. They've made their own tweaks by adding the big date. And of course, it is very, very distinctive. It doesn't look like every other Royal Oak and Nautilus impersonator, while still managing to fit in that segment comfortably and still bring the same amount of history and finesse to it. But let me know in the comments below, what do you think of the Overseas Generation 2 chronograph? Do you like this one? Do you prefer the new one? Or do you prefer some of its competitors? And if it was your own money, let's say you had, call it $25,000 US to spend on a chronograph, would you try and opt for a Daytona, the Royal Oak chronograph, this, or maybe something else? I'd love to know in the comments below. And of course, another big thanks to Timepiece 360 in Dubai for lending in this watch. Make sure to check their links in the description below to see their full collection. And of course, if you like this video, make sure you like it and share it. And if you want to see more pictures of the Overseas Chronograph and the infographics that I use, make sure you follow me on Instagram at Shaluso. And if you want to see new watch videos every week, then make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell as well so that you know when the next video is coming out. Last but not least, of course, thanks for watching this video, and we'll catch you on the next one.